Thank you all for coming. This is my first time at Identiverse, and I think it's been a real pleasant education to be in front of an audience of customers, banks and whatever, as opposed to just middlemen and implementers of various standards in forums, and it's been a very nice perspective, and I really enjoyed this morning's keynotes, because they're sort of asking us to think differently about what is going on. Now, I'm not going to talk about trust, and I'm not going to talk about identity very much, and the panel is going to go where the panel goes. I'll introduce myself, and the panelists should introduce themselves as well. They're much more well-known than I am. My role in the community for a decade plus is as an advocate and a representative of sort of the public perspective, mostly in the W3C data model work on DIDs and VCs, but also before that in UMA and other places. And to summarize, my background is, because I'm a physician, but I'm by career a medical device entrepreneur, I am a unique beast in that I have an almost equal foot in the regulated by the FDA and decentralized regulation by courts and hospital privileges of a professional. So if you want to sort of tie back how I got to the user-centric perspective, whether it's patient or physician or customer, this is where I come from. And at this point, I'll let Eve go ahead and introduce yourself, and Justin.
First of all, I can attest that Adrian is a unique beast. Yes. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with him. Eve Mailer, CTO of ForgeRock. If you didn't see the talk this morning, then I'll just explain that I do long-term innovation at ForgeRock.
I am Justin Richer. I'm a consultant. I have worked on a number of different things over the years. My primary focus is in standards and architecture for security.
Okay, so this is a quote from a colleague of mine at Patient Privacy Rights, and I think it summarizes both the topic of the talk as well as some of the issues that we were hearing about this morning, where consent is in quotes and is a dark pattern of the two people here on the panel and the stage with me. I'm going to try and sort of turn the human rights framing into something concrete, because all of us here are basically protocol architects in one way or another, or engineers, and focus on how we treat humans as if they have rights rather than asking them for consent. Protocols have a huge impact on human rights, and this short list is I think familiar to everybody. Oh, by the way, we have a lot of time. This is going to be a 15-minute presentation to set up the panel. So if people want to interrupt me, or any of us, I have some questions for the panelists, but please feel free to do so. So in general, you need regulation when market forces fail. And that's why, as I introduce myself, I look at things from a regulatory perspective. There's a couple of sort of takeaway messages here, and one of them is that the identity technologies and protocols that we've invented under the name of standardized digital identity and standardized trust frameworks and things like that are a real threat to human life when the regulatory domain is a free-for-all, at least in this country where we don't have federal privacy laws. We don't even have GDPR asking for purpose or to try to avoid the dark patterns. So when you combine the efficiency of standardizing the data model, which W3C has done really effectively, and I'm proud of that work, I was involved in it, and I think it's great work on both DIDs and verifiable credentials, but then you introduce protocols that make two things happen. One of them is that the ability to store and do surveillance and store it and use it now has grown exponentially, because you no longer have to deal with 50 different driver's license formats from different states, much less having to transcribe photos of a photographed driver's license and things like that. And I'm using those two examples judiciously, because in the presentation that was made earlier, a couple of days ago, about digital driver's license, some of the NDL standards, these are they're sort of looking at regulation to fix those problems that they've created. This is the problem of scale as a threat to human rights. And then the other problem is the tendency, and I think passkey and all of these things, which are great technologies, and I am a fan, but the idea that people will conveniently use strong credentials, where, for instance, an email address that was voluntary or weak or self-sovereign in some cases would have served as well for identity, is another dimension of the same problem with standardized digital credentials and wallets that make it easiest to just share everything because you're tired of giving consent. So what we have now, and what I feel has to change, and this is really maybe the prelude to one of my only points of engineering around human rights protocols to come in the next slide, is that we need to get away from protocols that are platform specific. Some of them become dark patterns, as was clearly said earlier today, and we've sort of learned that it is very difficult, even when you're in the European context or maybe anything other than China, it's very difficult to regulate how these platform-specific protocols around identity are going to work. So what are we doing? Well, we're just adding complexity, and I think that's also been brought up in many of the talks so far, and this is a short list around the things that I think we all recognize are adding to the discussion, not replacing yet anything. So here's my point, one of my maybe 2 or 3 points. Decentralized design can preserve human rights, but what do we mean by that? And so first we have to state the problem. And the problem is that a platform model uses consent for surveillance, uses trade to surveillance, like I said, the strong credentials and the standardized digital things, and then somebody monetizes that surveillance, which is why we don't have privacy laws at the federal level. So how do they do that? It's simple. They basically combine for convenience those 3 layers of the customer interaction, which are logically separate. And we could design for total substitutable separation, separate assortment of the way you sign in and sign things, the way you request information or do searches, and then the way you actually store or transact a purchase. So what we have now is examples of how a platform like Facebook is crossing all of these 3 things, where we might start to go, and it's very early days, and I had trouble finding decent examples of how you might cut the space differently in the protocol sense. These are a few examples, and I think you all in the audience could probably come up with much better examples than these, but this is kind of to get us started. This is my sort of takeaway message before we start the panel. If you want to do human rights by design instead of privacy by design, if we want to move beyond those pablums that could be so easily interpreted and consented away, then we would specifically avoid bundling of those three phases. We would respect self-sovereign identity. We have a very imperfect but a good example of that in sign-in with Ethereum work. It's not the end-all end-all. It has many problems, but it is a working example. And of course, as I mentioned, DIDs and VCs as data models are right there. Eve has led the discussion around delegation and the role in our community for decades, and I think it continues to be the essence of human-centered design. And then that means that there has to be a standardized authorization protocol. I can't think of how to separate the bundling, how to unbundle these 3 layers without there being a standardized authorization protocol like GNAP under what we all do. This is an eye chart, and I will leave it up here for the discussants who are going to take the technical questions. I can only take sort of the regulatory or policy questions that you have. And does anybody want to go through this for a minute before we start? Justin has seen it and just describe, and then that's it. Then the panel starts after. I think there may be one more slide. No, it's just the references.
You're in a much better position to describe what this chart
Okay.
is, because I saw it yesterday afternoon for 30 seconds.
Yes, this chart has gone through a number of revisions since I
has.
presented it to the...
This isn't what he emailed me a couple of weeks ago, which I think is a good thing, actually. I think it's evolution, yeah.
Okay, so I don't have a pointer, but there's a couple of things to notice here that points I want to make. Number one is the title, User-Centric Request Model. So notice there's no trust, there's no identity, there's no enterprise component to it, really. And that title is the brainchild of Wayne Chang, who is Spruce ID. He used to work, he's been a big player in the blockchain and self-sovereign identity work for a long time. And at IIW just a few months ago, he labeled my session with this, which I think is an absolutely fitting title. What's going on in here is basically it's an invitation for those of us that are protocol engineers, protocol experts, or maybe business experts as well, to think as to which of the current standards, protocol standards, and what new protocol work is being done, for instance, in GNAP, is going to fit where in this model. And if you find issues with any of this, again, this session is here with the panelists here to discuss it. What is the main point this is making? For data minimization purposes, going back all the way to fair information practices, in a user-centric model, you want to have the request go to something that the user control, because that promotes a symmetrical relationship. So I'll give you a very quick example of what's bad. What's bad is the mobile driver's license model, where you have the identity issuer, or the credential issuer, issuing authority they call it, and you have the verifier, or the relying party, and then you have the customer, or the subject of the transaction. And that is the most asymmetrical relationship you could possibly have. Here you have this person that's basically barefoot, talking to somebody that they're forced to use, the issuing authority, and something that they really need to use, which is they need to get on that plane or in that movie. And so the only way to prevent the surveillance and to split rationally those 3 layers of sign-in, interaction, and transaction is to figure out some way in our protocol world how to have the requests go to something that represents the resource owners, the subject's policies, rather than something like an authorization server or an enterprise entity that may probably, or by definition, has to represent the resource processors, the relying parties, the resource servers' interests. And that's what this diagram is about, and I'll stop there. I don't know how successful I've been in capturing both the framing and the technical challenge. And with that, I will, who wants to speak first? And then I'll ask some questions, unless the audience has questions now.
Do you want to go first?
Or soon.
Okay, because I got opinions. All right. And I think a really, thanks for this, Adrian. I think a really important thing to think about diagrams like this is that these are not necessarily, each of these lines is not necessarily like a single deployed system or a single cohesive deployed system. These are roles that are being taken in protocols. And I give a lot of talks on like protocol design and like, information flow between systems and stuff like that. And a lot of people take a look at this and they're like, well, this means I have 5 different computers. Not necessarily. One of the important things here is that these roles in this model actually don't map particularly cleanly to what we have in delegation protocols of today or even of the near future. So things like OAuth, things like GNAP, like these are not exactly clean mappings to things like the authorization server, like the client and things like that. That said, there is a lot of overlap and a lot of sort of shared functionality between these different bits. So one of the things that I think is the most important about this is that if you want to have all of your stuff going through something that the user controls, that's all well and good. However, you need to also take into account the sort of the needs and perspectives of the resource that's being protected. And in the past, people trying to apply things like the OAuth model, like UMA, the obvious thing is, well, we'll just let everybody just bring their own authorization server that's going to issue its own tokens, and everybody's just going to trust it, and it's going to be great. Yeah, no, that's ridiculous. Like, no RS is going to do that because that is such a gigantic liability for them. And even if they did in the very, very small sort of proof of concept deployments that I've done that did something like that, what you end up doing is kind of having your RS behind a gateway that actually does all of that processing and trusting and checking the allow lists and block lists and all of that other stuff for you. Because at the end of the day, protocols like OAuth are all about making it simple for the RS to make that decision, what do I do with this request that's coming in, right? That is the technological value proposition for the RS. So this is where the design of a protocol like GNAP, that's the Grant Negotiation and Authorization Protocol, at least that's what I think what it stands for. I honestly forget half the time. It's a new protocol in the IETF building on the experiences that we've had over the last decade with OAuth, with various revisions of UMA, OpenID Connect, and all these other things, right? One of the things that GNAP does is that it doesn't try to outsource the AS. It says, okay, the AS and the RS are going to have a trust relationship. That might be dynamic if that makes sense for your world, but there's going to be a strong trust relationship there because that is literally the job of the AS to hold the trust for the RS, the resource server. What GNAP does do, though, is that it gets us away from the assumptions of the OAuth world where we assume that the resource owner is going to show up in a browser and log in order to make decisions. GNAP has an entire design around getting away from that assumption and letting a lot of different things happen. Some of those things that can happen are talking to your user agents, are talking to authenticators, are talking to different things that are beyond just logging in with an account and clicking the OK button, right? And so you can actually map things like this to GNAP in a few different ways, even though this protocol flow is not GNAP. It's not OAuth. This is something working at a layer above that. The machining and the tooling is growing in ways to help enable things like this.
I think this will end up being an orthogonal comment. Not sure. Who here wasn't at my earlier talk where I talked about, okay. I talked about some of the tensions that we have in the picture of outsourcing anything. Relying parties of any sort, or service providers who might rely on somebody else to give them something, have a business decision to make. And so, I mean, there is a trust model. I mean, UMA tried to do this thing where it separates the AS and the RS conceptually, and you can separate them by domain. You don't have to. And what we've seen grow up is some trust model work. I'm looking at Alec over here, who's currently running that group, that is tracking pretty closely with the kind of thing that you see in terms of, I mentioned open banking in my earlier talk, the business trust that needs to establish to hand out a client ID. Because you could automate it and do it an awful lot, but most businesses really are not comfortable with that. And so outsourcing anything is hard. Now, since we're here to talk about human rights, the barrier to sort of trying some new things and making the dividing lines different, I see as trying to figure out how to incentivize any of the parties. So maybe some of these things end up co-located in some instances, maybe they're not. The parties need to be willing to say that they are acting in any one instance as a fiduciary for a person. And it starts with the very first column, actually. If you've got a user agent, which might be a wallet or whatever, might be a client, whatever it is, I have real questions about how well that's going. Everything acts on behalf of people until we have something, like they talked about jacking in, I think in Snow Crash, where you just sort of jack into the net. Until we get to that day, and then you better trust the, I don't know what it is, quarter-inch thing that you put in. It's all extending some trust, and I'm going to say extending some vulnerability to some party who's not you. And so, a number of people are playing with different models for how to make that work. Like I spent some time talking to Dick Hart last night about how Hello is going. I don't know that he had a talk here this week, but it's interesting. The respectful data brokerage kind of architecture that I showed earlier this morning is another way to sort of cut things so that people don't find themselves, people and businesses and service providers in whatever columns you end up having, so that they don't find themselves in essential conflict that regulation then has to fix, because it's always going to do it imperfectly. It's always going to do it in a backwards-looking way that doesn't account for new technology. I mean, we've got a discussion draft of a federal privacy law now in the US, and I shudder to think what new innovations that are going to help us, it's going to cut off avenues to. Some thoughts.
Okay. Oh, please.
So, in terms of human rights,
Do you want a microphone, or?
We can do that, or we can repeat the question.
Okay.
It's for the recording.
fair. In terms of human rights, is the untrusted or bad actor that we're trying to design around the government or law enforcement, or what is it we're trying to deal with? What specific actor are we worried about violating us?
So the question is, who is the bad actor? Is it the government? Is it law enforcement? Is it anything? And I'll take that first. The untrusted actor is a matter of your perspective. This system at the bootstrap, at the very top of the process, the untrusted actor is the user. So we don't know who they are. We don't know what rights they have. We don't know what access they have. It's the requesting party is showing up. They are the untrusted actor. They might be an attacker. They might be the resource owner. They might be somebody who has rights to things but is something else. But in terms of the human rights of surveillance that Adrian was talking about at the beginning, a lot of people point out that when you log in through your IDP knows what sites you're logging into. That can be a potential problem, especially if that's getting either monetized or used to track and enforce different things and stuff like that. That can definitely be an issue. On the flip side of that, though, the relying parties and the service providers downstream, they're the ones that are actually holding your data and stuff like that. So they need to be able to trust external parties. So when you're coming in with that access token, with that assertion, that party is untrusted until all of that's verified as well. And so it's is this artifact that I'm getting, is that something that's been passed through and modified by an untrusted party? I need to be able to detect that. I need to be able to see what's going on there before I can actually give you, the requester, the information that I'm looking after. So a little bit of a non-answer, but I think that it's an entire constellation of untrusted parties that need to trust each other in some way. And that's what makes this a hard and interesting problem.
I'll comment that extending finer grained or less trust, opening yourself up to less vulnerability to achieve some effect. I mean, it's actually kind of a principle of zero trust, to use a trope. I think all sides have the same aim. They just haven't yet come together to find the interoperable intersection of what they can achieve together. And I think we're probably going to have a perverse thing happen when we manage to get people be able to interact more safely anonymously in that it means they have more incentives for first-party fraud that we're then going to have to battle. And it's one of those sort of, I'm going to say, transparents that, you know, we're currently not paying very much attention to, but, you know, the approach of, you know, trusting somebody because they provided a verifiable credential that doesn't necessarily identify them, I think there's going to be some interesting learnings when we actually do that at scale.
And I'll give you the other perspective, the non-security and non-trust perspective, but it's no more important than what these two perspectives are, which is the idea of transparency and accountability being built into the system from the ground up. So the problem that I focus on is hidden surveillance and is a lack of transparency in what the purpose of data processing is when you're processing the data. That is baked into systems, including systems like HIPAA, that are anything but a privacy preserving thing. And so the whole point of the relayering, my call for us to tear apart and have separate assortment at the sign-in and signing versus the search versus the transaction storage or finalization level, is to make it as hard as possible for there to be invisible, transparent, or unaccountable or unauditable transactions anywhere along the line. And that doesn't conflict with either point that these guys just made, but that is the organizing principle that drives this particular framing of the problem.
There's something I proposed earlier today that, you know, I can maybe put in a different guise here. You know, the zero trust architecture talks about software bill of materials. So you know what you have, you know what, you know, third-party packages might have vulnerabilities. And I was sort of talking about this notion of a subsidiary documentation, you know, a subsidiarity documentation. So, and making transparent what connections you have, what partners you have, where data goes, and how much could be measured about how antithetical to the interests of the person whose data may be flowing. If you had something like a, you know, a bill of materials of that, it would be really interesting. And then, you know, I think we could start to automate and scale the transparency aspect.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just a sec, because I just wanted to say, so the transparency, I think, is an absolutely fascinating part of this, because if you basically look at this in terms of, in a very, very rough mapping, this is a resource server here, this is the authorization server, because it's, you know, it's granting some subset of capabilities to something. This ends up being the client, and then what is all this over here? One of the things that GNAP does, like I mentioned before, is that this authorization server, of how you present things to the authorization server, this is now abstracted in a different way than previous delegation protocols have done, which means that at this step, the authorization server, to Eve's bill of materials idea here, is the authorization server can be very upfront about, like, these are the kinds of things that I need to know in order to fulfill your request to get a credential to do the thing that you actually need to do. Right? So this is abstracting it even further from the resource server, because the resource server, let's say this is like, you know, my bank account, and it needs to give $50 to some other bank account. Like, the authorization server is the thing that says, like, okay, I need you to prove that you have access to this bank account, or, you know, the authority to do this. And I could do that by sending somebody there and having them log in and click an OK button. Still a valid option, still works in a lot of use cases. But it could also be that you've got a voucher, right? It could also be that you've got some other credential that says that you're allowed to do this and provide this bit of information for things to go through. There's a lot of different ways that that could actually be fulfilled here. And the authorization server is now in a position where it can start to talk about that in this more transparent way.
And one very quick comment on this, is that if you want to picture something in your mind, picture the break the glass scenario for a physician accessing a restricted part of the health record, a particular. Picture that in the zero trust architecture sense, What are you doing there? You're A, dealing with the fact that the secure thing to do is the easiest thing to do, right? Click OK, you're in. You're processing a context-specific request, which has what? The physician. Yes, this thing only shows up to the emergency physician in the first place. So somewhere you've been screened that you're the emergency doc and get to see whatever you want in this particular case. And what else are you doing? You're asking them to sign, which is the OK, literally, something that's going to be audited, saying that the purpose for this is that I need to treat you right now. It's an emergency. So that's the GDPR component, if you want to think of it that way. And so something as simple as that is what drives the request model, the user-centric request model idea, and these guys.
So years ago, the three of us were all involved in a working group in the OpenID Foundation called HEART, dealing with a lot of healthcare-related questions. And the break the glass scenario was always an utterly fascinating one to me. And we did our best to shoehorn it into OAuth and UMA with a special scope that had certain rights and things like that.
It's kind of clever. I mean, I'll say it was clever because it turns it from an exception process into something that is auditable. Yeah.
Exactly. And so to me, always one of the most interesting things to this is that when you made this request that had this parameter that's like, hi, I'm showing up, I am making a break the glass request, that is a signal to the system that says, this is not the resource owner in any OAuth sense. This is not like any normal kind of thing. The AS now actually has more surveillance requirements put on it, right? If we're going to go back to this notion of human rights, that's something where I want the AS to surveil it. Even if it's an AS that I don't own or control, I absolutely want that AS to know who's there, who's asking, when they asked, what they asked for, why they asked for it. Because if somebody's getting at my stuff, I have the right to know that. And that's because of my relationship with the AS and the AS controlling that. Now downstream, it is again important that the RS just knows, however this got here, this request comes in, it's okay, it's fine. The RS should never know that this is an emergency physician asking for this and all of this other stuff, right? But this request for access comes with audit requirements. It comes with all sorts of other layers of things that regular requests don't necessarily do.
I want to play Rat Hole Queen. We got a question here.
Yes.
So, yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I suppose my worry with some of this stuff is, I completely agree that delegation needs to be kind of first class in the protocols. But my worry with some of this stuff is it's almost leading towards more choice for the end user. Mm-hmm. And for your sophisticated, very privacy-aware end user, great. For most end users, it's just too much. Like, do we not need to? Is the problem less at the protocol level and more at, like the cookie thing is just all absolutely ridiculous. Don't we need something more like, Creative Commons, and we have like, I suppose what you're saying earlier in terms of this auditable kind of, this is exactly what I'm going to do with your data, but it's in a machine-readable format, and it can be audited, and comply with it. But that's not really at the protocol level.
Well, I'll take the first part of that. My role in the community has been to try and do a reference implementation or an example implementation of some of the things that I advocate for. And midway through this process, it's maybe about 5 years ago, we faced exactly that. And we came up with the idea that the self-sovereign entity could not be just, remember, I was already working on self-sovereign identity and self-sovereign authorization servers in the UMA 2 context, that you couldn't put that burden on the user. It is so asymmetrical in that mobile driver's license example that I get, that it's nonsensical. And Eve talked about this in her keynote. She had that fourth party there. It was a sign. And what we do in HIE of 1, which is the project, the open source example implementation of what is soon going to be GNAP. Doesn't have GNAP in it yet, which goes on, and it's not a commercial anything. What we figured out is that the self-sovereign entity had to be like a church congregation, or trade union, or a gang, or or they might be a fiduciary. In other words, they had to be somebody that you can choose, the way you choose a fiduciary. You choose a doctor, you choose a defense lawyer, and that's a human right. So you choose a partner.
There's something that has been ensconced
as a delegate.
in law.
Anyway, so
CCPA has ensconced in law authorized agents, and it's really an interesting role for that reason. You know, it's someone who can be a fiduciary for you, somebody who's powerful like a company, but can act on your behalf. And that's where up-leveling and abstracting consent and permissions is super important, and it's largely at the experience level, but it benefits from some of these support structures, I think. So like, you know, I talked a little bit about IoT this morning, and like, you know, there's this overwhelming amount of devices and data, and you can't like press OK every time. Like GDPR would probably have you, because they want it to be fine-grained, press OK every time something happens in your car. Well, it's actually not good for a person to do that. And so the experience implications, the rights implications need to be up-leveled. And I've been using the word abstracted because it sounds too much like implied consent, which is a bad thing. In essence, you want to drive a lot of behavior on other parties' part according to your, you know, overall instructions. So a few things can do that. Authorized agents can do that. They work on your behalf. AI can help do that, because at some point it's a big data problem, even just for you. And I think that was it.
Yeah. And I think it's important that as we go down the road of solving these things on the technology level, we don't end up just creating another NASCAR login problem where users show up and it's like, okay, now. So I remember in early demos that, you know, proof of concepts that even I did, there was like, choose your authorization server. Nobody's going to choose their authorization server. Like it's just, and the thing is, yeah, the mock-ups are still out there, and it's like, it's bad for the user, it's bad for the RS, it's not the right way to think about it. What does help though, and that's something that I know, this is something that all three of us has talked about for years, is that there are different layers in process here, and it's the business, legal, and technical layers. It's the BLT sandwich of, I didn't make up the term, but, or was it bourbon, lemon, and tonic is the other way to do it.
But now it's bolts. There's bolts now. Have you guys heard?
What? Business,
Business, operational, legal, technical, and societal. I kind of like it.
Oh, come on. Anyway, I'll stick with the BLT, thank you. So the important thing here is that, you know, as per the question, we're, some of these things don't work at the technology level. They have to be solved elsewhere. Absolutely do. Regulation takes a long time to catch up on things. Like Eve said, it's always backwards looking because it has to be, right? You know, society takes a long time to catch up, and then law eventually catches up to where society is, right? That's just how it works. So the important thing is that when we're talking about these different roles and what the technology enables, we do need to think about separating these roles from the actual, you know, like I said at the very beginning, from the actual like pieces of software, the actual bits of technology on there. When I went up there and I was pointing, you know, authorization server, blah, 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 that's a very loose mapping to the roles of what's going on here, and that's hardly the only way to do that. But I do think it's important to be able to look at what our protocols can do and what they can enable and accomplish in these other wider terms. And at the same time, when we're thinking in terms of laws and regulations and rights and things like that, think about what is actually enabled by the technologies that we're creating or that we just have to deal with. Like, because for example, nobody likes X509, but it enables a lot of things. It has a lot of features to it that we kind of deal with, and that drives a lot of what people sort of figure out that we can allow people to do, that we can enable people to do.
As in affordances. So, you know, there was a usability talk earlier, Nishant did a great talk, and I would call those affordances of X509. And that's, you know, how we end up using them. And there was, I think, some questions out here.
Okay, hold on one second. I want to take the moderator's prerogative to reserve at least 5, maybe 10 minutes for some questions for the audience and the panelists that I want the feedback on to move forward. So we may have time for more questions afterwards. Let's take the 2, but let's make it short.
Yeah, sure.
I'll make it very short. You guys know what I'm doing a lot, which is like human factor in identity. I love this whole time. Question what I see in my personal work with people is that if you make it really complex, right, there will be a social engineer who will find the way to deviate from that thing and help get the user to say, oh, that's too complex, I'll find you an easier way to do it. That's one. So how we can help with that. The second thing is, people have rights, and 99% of those rights, they don't even know they need it. They have no idea. So how can we educate and not scare people, and how can we protect them from social engineer attack, which I'm guaranteeing you, we're gonna do something like that, that's gonna happen. Make your life easy. Thank you.
Okay. So the first is if things are too complicated, people will work around them. That was literally the entire topic that I spoke on yesterday. So go look up my talk, please. I'm actually not joking. That's literally what I spoke about, is the points of friction in a system that cause people to come up with workarounds. I've got a long background in usability and collaboration systems that I was doing long before I got into the security side of things, right? I fell backwards into security. It's a whole story. Anyway.
The second thing was,
Yeah, you take the second.
I don't remember what the second thing was.
Let's move on to the next question. We're running out of time.
About social engineering.
Yeah, social engineering.
Yeah,
that's-
social engineering.
That's the
Okay,
workarounds,
yeah.
That's the friction.
Yeah. Social engineers, people can also work around because they have something to do. And that's one of the things I liked about Justin's talk, I'll just say. Oh, protect people.
Don't make it hard.
Yeah. Well, to make the right thing to do be the easiest thing to do. And we have some existence proofs now, which is so interesting. I mentioned, Signal and DuckDuckGo in my talk earlier. The experience of those things is good enough. People who are motivated have been gravitating to them, and certain things have been happening, sort of whatever, world events or WhatsApp doing something or somebody doing something else. I personally am skeptical about security education. That was why I asked you the question in your talk. The School of Hard Knocks is always way more motivating, and you don't want people to have to suffer through that, but it's what motivates people to change their behavior. It's why people leave services. You don't love your dry cleaner. You leave a dry cleaner who burned your shirt. It's really, a bank is really sticky, but, and I don't think that open banking has really worked for service portability so much, but indirectly, people have realized sometimes it's worth it to move on.
Okay,
And
we
so-
have another question. There,
Yep.
Alec.
Going to say in relation to like his discussion about cookies and your discussion about letting people choose their authorization server, wouldn't the best option just be to give people a default? Like they're pushing cookies towards like instead of like manually selecting each cookie you want, the buttons are like have all cookies or have only the required ones for functionality.
So I will just mention choices by different solutions really can affect that. I don't know anybody else who's using the DuckDuckGo browser on Mac OS. It will manage the the least cookieful experience for you. And as long as it's integrated with the ways that you need to log in, it's a really powerful way. I actually use the little thing, the fire icon that just blows away all tabs and cookies multiple times a day. It's hard to stop once you start. So you can't mandate defaults, and defaults can be used as dark patterns. But I think solutions can be offered that come up with things people like better, and they don't have to suck.
Okay,
You heard it here first.
so the title of the talk is has in it interaction of protocols between W3C and IETF, because they're not the only standards groups involved, but they're the ones that are closest to my heart anyway, in my work. And and so this is a question for the panelists and for the audience. And so the first question, and I think it's just a simple yes, no answer, is standardized digital identity a dual-use technology, where dual-use technologies include like nuclear power or gene engineering, CRISPR, where you can change the species, and kill off the mosquitoes, et cetera. So if you have a dual-use technology like those examples, then there has to be a forum, there has to be a conversation as to how you're going to mitigate the harmful aspects of the dual use while preserving as much of the power generation and disease fighting potential of the innovation. So just a quick yes, no, is that a bad framing? Are we now talking, given DIDs and VCs being a reality and passkey being a reality, are we now in the domain of a dual use technology in terms of human rights, or am I overstating? Anybody, as long as it's quick, because I have another question to follow that one.
By that definition, I cannot think of a single technology up to and including shoes and eyeglasses that is not dual use, right? A good set of optical lenses can make it so that the snipers can kill people a lot better than they used to be able to. I mean, and, you know, and it's also, if I were wearing my glasses, I could actually see the audience right now. Hello, blurries. And, but it's like...
no, Justin, that's not...
So I
think
think my answer is yes.
Okay,
right?
I'll push back on that in one sense. In the pharmaceutical business, you have the concept of either pre-market or post-market approval. And the shoes and those kinds of things that are dual use, you bring them to market first, and then you figure out whether there's a dual thing. The dual use technologies are the things that you know ahead of time, before people figure out nuclear power, or before they figure out how to commercialize CRISPR. That you need to have a forum, a discussion about how to mitigate the second side. So it's not the same thing.
I'm reluctant to use a formal designation just because so many things get messed up by people with good intentions, and it can prevent finding the solution that you really need. But there is sort of an objective bit of proof that there's a conversation going on kind of at that level already. People who have been waiting with bated breath for, you know, NIST 800-63 Rev 4. We're working on it. I know why you're working on it. Jeremy talked about it a few weeks ago. He might have talked about it this week. You know, some of the conversations around facial recognition were really giving people pause. And I mean, you're in it, right? So you know. And they want to get it right. It's proven to be sensitive and complicated, and so it bears watching. There's this whole conversation about permissionless innovation, and if that's a good thing, or, you know, should we move fast and break things, or can we not do that with something? I think we should not be fooled that the technologies that are being defined today, this huge new stack of standards, and there's dozens of them, we should not be fooled into thinking that we know all of their consequences before we experience them in production versus the stuff that we're familiar with from the before time.
Okay.
If I may, very quickly. For those of you that saw my talk on Tuesday of this week, the refrain from my talk is that it is always easier to come up with a solution than it is to define the problem, right? That is just always, always going to be true. And these dual-use forums are all about defining the problem. But people are going to, regardless of what these forums say, they're going to find the solutions. They're going to find the uses. And I think that there is value in getting smart people to think about things ahead of time, but it's never going to really stop things from happening. It does, however, help us be prepared for some set of things. So, you know, it's always balance.
I'm just going to ask the last sort of moderator question. We only have a couple of minutes left anyway. If it's fair to frame the potential solution or the mitigation to the human rights issues, depending on whether you want to talk about it in a positive or the negative sense, as an interaction between IETF and W3C protocols. How does our community, where does our community convene this conversation, which is the equivalent of setting up, you know, an ongoing panel on, you know, how nuclear power is going to be, proliferation, on nuclear proliferation, I think it was called, or the equivalent thing for cloning.
Yeah. So I will say the IETF does have a human rights working and research group. I forget exactly where they fall on that line. But there is a dedicated forum for discussing human rights of the IETF's technical protocols. That is one such forum. There are others also.
Just on that, one sec. If anybody wants to collaborate in IETF, for example, with me, I'm a novice at IETF, and wants to join as an editor or chair or whatever, you are, please contact me, because I'm interested in doing that. By myself, I may not be able to even do it by charter, but I shouldn't be doing it anyway. So thank you.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say Stack Overflow. That's where the discussion happens.
Stack Overflow is where the discussion happens. In terms of hands-on implementation, absolutely. The fascinating thing about Stack Overflow is that these discussions happen over years and now decades. And so you can actually get, if you find the right slice of the internet on Stack Overflow, you can get some really fascinating looks about how attitudes have changed towards things over time.
On top of that, borrowing some language from corporate speak, I'd say this is a whole community motion. It has to be, we're socializing it here this week. Everybody is talking about it. There's a lot of self-reflection, like in today's 3 morning keynotes, I noticed. I think it's really important. I think we need to pair that with what I was calling sharper edged criteria, being really clear about what the outcomes would be, what the metrics would be if we succeeded. And I think, Adrian, you've been a champion of that for many years. And different efforts have to decide what it is they're trying to solve for, and then you can test to see if they solve for them. Yep. So I think those 2 things together would really work.
And my close is that anytime you make a technological decision, you are making a political statement, you are making a human rights statement, you are making an equity and equitability statement just by making a choice or by making choices available. I'm an engineer. I write software and build things and stuff like that. It is way too easy to fall into this trap of, I'm just writing code. The code doesn't really know what's going on. It's totally fine. But every single choice that you make in that is actually taking a stance. And so always, always, always keep that in mind when you're designing and building systems, especially to Adrian's point here, I believe today, when you're designing protocols, because these protocols make assumptions about how the world connects.
I'll just have one final takeaway.
You don't need that mic.
Oh, that's true. It's put yourself in the framing of, are you in the middle of an asymmetrical interaction? Are you contributing to it? Are you engineering in that direction? And is there anything you can do, either through delegation or transparency, that we talked about the logging features by default? Is there anything you can do through the mechanisms we discussed briefly here today to mitigate the asymmetry of power of who's paying you for that might or might not be a dark pattern, or to develop and work on that particular protocol? Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.